Welcome to the PAES Lab. This is the fourth PAES Lab training video. This is the first of two videos that cover scoring. Scoring is the most complex part of the PAES Lab, and it must be done accurately to achieve valid assessment results. In this video, we will explain how to assign scores. In the next video, we will teach you where and how to record the scores that you assign. The PAES Performance Summary Report details a student's employment potential. For educators who use PAES, it can be an essential tool for transitioning a student into the working world and for crafting a student's IEP. The report is generated entirely from the data that supervisors collect and record, so the accuracy of the final report hinges on the accuracy of the scores that supervisors assign. Understanding this is critical. For each job an employee attempts, scores are assigned for 5 criteria: work quality, Q, rate of work, R, interest, I, level of assistance, A, and number of trials, T. An employee's work quality score is determined by how many errors the employee made during their first attempt to perform the job. An employee's rate of work score is determined by the amount of time the employee spent on their first attempt to perform the job. An employee's interest score is determined by how much the employee liked the job during their first attempt. An employee's level of assistance score is determined by the maximum amount of assistance the employee needed to perform the job correctly. And finally, an employee's number of trials is the number of attempts they made before performing the job successfully. Now that we've reviewed the terminology, let's drill down into each score and how it's assigned. We'll be reviewing the other terms related to assigning scores later in this video. Follow along in your scoring guide as we review assigning scores. An employee's quality of work score is assessed using the scoring instructions for each job, which are listed in the appropriate component QRG. Work quality, which is calculated on the first trial only, can be a 1, a 2, or a 3. If the employee performed the job without any errors on their first trial, they've earned a Q score of 1. Assign a score of 2 if the employee performed the job with only 1 or 2 errors on their first trial. If the employee made 3 or more errors on their first trial, assign a score of 3. An employee's work rate score is based on the amount of time it took to perform the job. Like quality, it is also only assigned on the first trial and can be either a 1, a 2, or a 3. There are 2 amounts of time posted on the back of each job card. Both times are posted in minutes and seconds. If the employee performed the job in less time than the smaller of the 2 times posted on the job card, they earn a work rate score of 1. This is considered a competitive work rate. If the amount of time it took to perform the job on the first trial is in between the 2 amounts of time posted on the job card, assign a work rate score of 2. This is considered a semi-competitive work rate. If an employee performed the job in more time than the larger of the 2 times on the job card, assign them a work rate score of 3. This is considered a non-competitive work rate. An employee's interest score indicates how much they liked or disliked a job once they have attempted it for the first time. Like work rate and quality, interest is recorded on the first attempt only and is divided into scores of 1, 2, or 3. Employees should have recorded their own interest on their work record form before you assign scores on their performance. Check to make sure that they have. Employees can make several types of errors when indicating their interest. They might mark the same level of interest for every job. They might mark interest based on their mood that day. For example, it would not be appropriate for the employee to mark smiley faces or other facial expressions, as those tend to measure how they feel that day, not necessarily how interested they are in doing the job. In some cases, you might need to help an employee think about their level of interest. For example, if you find an employee is marking the same level of interest for all the jobs they perform, you might ask, I see you marked high interest on a number of jobs. If you had to choose which of those jobs you could do today, which one would you choose? That summarizes what scores to record for quality, work rate, and interest. Remember, all 3 of these scores are recorded on the first attempt only. They do not change on later trials. The next 2 scores, assistance and trials, however, change as an employee makes more attempts on a job. The goal of the PAES assessment is to find out what employees are capable of doing on their own with as little help as possible. Don't give an employee assistance they don't need. This requires a break in habit for many of us in special education because staff is used to being helpful, and many of our students are used to being helped. The first tip in breaking this habit is to take off your teacher hat when you walk into a PAES lab and really think of yourself as an employer. The PAES work procedure and terminology is designed to help students think of themselves as employees, and you can encourage this mindset with your own behavior by resisting the urge to help. At the end of the day, it will help prepare your students for employment. The other important tip is to use the what, how, why type questions whenever possible to see if you can help an employee arrive at an answer on their own. For instance, when an employee first calls a supervisor over during step 5, first simply ask, "Do you know how to do this job?" If the employee says yes, but you have doubts, try asking, "Well, what would you think you should do?" Here are some other questions you can use. What steps are you ready for on the work procedure chart? What step did you miss? Let's start at the beginning. Did you do this step? What do you do next? To see if the employee understands the specific job, or to help them arrive at the answers on their own, try questions like, what do you think you will do on this job? Did you read your job card procedure? Tell me what step number 1 says. How do you think you will use the sifter? What item do you need for this job that you don't have yet? Where will you find this piece of equipment? The thing to remember is that questions help the employee arrive at the answer on their own. Statements give them the answer. Ask questions. Now let's go through the levels of assistance in detail. If an employee needs no assistance to complete a job, assign a score of 1, which indicates independent performance. If you've asked questions that help the employee discover how to do the job properly themselves, but you did not tell them how to do it, you still assign a score of 1. If, however, an employee needs to be told how to do the job, that counts as verbal assistance. Assign a score of 2. If you've talked to the employee about the job but haven't given them any information about it, assign a score of 1. Whether or not to assign a score of 2 all boils down to whether you gave verbal information about how the job is done. Remember, when giving verbal assistance, don't use hand gestures to show an employee how a job is done. That would be considered a demonstration. That brings us to our next assistance score. If an employee needs to be shown how to do a job, that's considered a demonstration. Assign a score of 3. Finally, if the supervisor needs to sit with the employee and correct their errors in real time, that's considered guided practice. Assign a score of 4. Guided practice is rarely given to an employee before they make a first attempt. However, if you do give a guided practice before a first attempt, it counts as both a trial and an error and will affect quality and number of trial scores. We will go deeper into guided practice and how it affects other scores in video 5, PAES Scoring Part 2. Once the supervisor has provided the needed level of assistance, they should walk away and allow the employee to attempt the job. If the employee doesn't perform the job correctly, more assistance can be given before the next attempt. If you give the employee more assistance before the next attempt, the assistance score increases. Remember, an employee's final assistance score for any job is the maximum amount of assistance the employee needed to perform the job correctly. Finally, let's review the number of trials score. An employee's number of trials on a job is simply the number of attempts they made to perform the job correctly. If an employee completes a job on their first attempt, they have a number of trial score of 1. Each attempt is counted as a trial. If a supervisor intervenes to assist an employee, that intervention is counted as another trial. Partially completed jobs at the end of lab don't count as trials. Now that we've reviewed the numerical scores for quality, work rate, interest, assistance, and trials, there's one last category to cover on the topic of assigning scores: accommodations and modifications. Accommodations do not change the outcomes of jobs. Accommodations mirror the kind of support employees might receive at a job site. Models of a completed job or samples or guides showing completed steps are examples of accommodations. Modifications, on the other hand, change expected job outcomes. Requiring fewer steps or less work are examples of modifications. It's important to distinguish between the two. While accommodations and modifications both help an employee complete a job, accommodations don't change job outcomes, while modifications do. Sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish between assistance and an accommodation. Remember, an accommodation stays with an employee while they attempt a job. Assistance is given to an employee before they attempt a job. For employees with significant needs, PAES supervisors have 2 alternative scoring methods they can use if necessary: the optional scoring process and the subtask assessment. The optional scoring process allows supervisors to provide all levels of assistance if necessary, without having the employee repeat the entire job. Keep in mind, however, that employees with higher function need to repeat the entire job if they make mistakes to learn the importance of doing the best they can each time they perform a job. When an employee cannot perform an entire job, even with assistance and accommodations, but can perform certain parts of the job, the supervisor can assess the employee using a subtask assessment. A subtask assessment is job-specific and does not have to be performed for all jobs. It should only be used when it's clear the employee cannot perform the whole job. A subtask assessment breaks the job down into parts and identifies which parts of the job can be performed successfully without supervisor intervention. Philosophically, if the optional scoring process is like an accommodation of PAES, the subtask assessment would be a modification, since it changes the outcome of the job. In video 12, we go into more detail about assessing employees who have significant needs, along with how to record scores for accommodations, modifications, the optional scoring process, and subtask assessments. Now that we've gone over PAES scoring, let's review. Every job an employee performs receives scores for quality, work rate, interest, level of assistance, and number of trials. Level of assistance and number of trial scores can increase on later attempts, but can never decrease. Scores for quality, work rate, and interest are recorded on the first trial only. Accommodations don't change job outcomes. Modifications do. If an employee is interrupted while completing a job due to a supervisor intervening, that counts as a trial. However, if an employee is interrupted while completing a job by the end of the shift, that attempt does not count as a trial. This completes the training video on PAES scores, what to record. The next video covers where and how to record scores. Thanks.